brief overview of the economic outlook of the area they have been invited to discuss, the global economy, the U.S. outlook, and the forecast for Arkansas. After all our experts have spoken, we'll have a panel discussion, and all of you are invited to submit questions for me to ask our experts using the green index cards on your tables. The green index cards will all be collected once this final speaker is done. So now I'll move forward with introducing our first panelist, Greg Daco. Greg is the chief economist at EY. Previously was chief U.S. economist at Oxford Economics, where he led a team of high-caliber economists producing forecast, analysis, and research on the U.S. and global economy. Before that, Greg was director of U.S. macroeconomics, IHS Global Insight, now IHS Market. Greg is a member of the National Association for Business Economics and the American Economic Association. He is a former board director of the National Association for Business Economics, as well as a former president of the New York chapter and founder and former president of the Boston chapter of that organization. Please join me in welcoming Greg Daco to the 2024 Business Forecast Luncheon. Greg?
All right. Hello, everyone. Hope everybody's doing well. Perfect. All right, so what I wanted to do today was take you all through a little tour around the world. So strap on your seatbelts, because it might get a little bumpy as we go through the different parts of the world in this year where we're going to be rebalancing. 2024 is going to be a year where the global economy is rebalancing. If I can get the clicker to work. There we go. All right. So before we look at 2024, I think it's important to take a look at what happened in 2023. And the reality is that 2023 was a year of global economic outperformance. One of the key characteristics of the outlook in 2023 was that global GDP was expected to grow about 2%. It turned out to be growing around 3%. And a large part of this economic outperformance came from the U.S. The U.S. economy was expected to grow about 0.5%. And we learned yesterday that, in fact, the U.S. economy grew 2.5%. So a 2 percentage point outperformance by the U.S. economy, driving this global economic outperformance. And what were the key factors behind this global economic outperformance, you might ask? Well, number one was the fact that we had labor market resilience. We had an environment where the value of talent was much higher than it was pre-pandemic, and that allowed or forced business leaders to retain their talent and not proceed with mass layoffs despite expectations of a recession around the corner. That allowed consumers to continue spending with solid income support. The other factor that supported this economic outperformance was the fact that we had an environment where the growth mix in terms of goods versus services continued to favor strong spending on services. The third factor was that household and corporate balance sheets were still relatively healthy, and that limited the pass-through of tightening by central banks around the world because a lot of that debt was held at fixed cost. And then finally, across a number of major economies around the world, we still had solid fiscal impetus. The combination of those four factors led to this economic outperformance in 2023. Now, it's not just that the economy outperformed in 2023, it's that this outperformance came along with lower inflation over the course of the past 12 to 18 months, and faster disinflation than what's initially anticipated. Now, there are a number of reasons behind this faster disinflationary path than was expected, but one of the key factors behind that was the fact that energy prices fell quite sharply. We had a surge in energy prices post-pandemic, and then after the onset of the war in Ukraine, that resorbed itself and led to lower energy prices, lower oil prices, lower gas prices, as well as lower other commodities prices. This led to a strong disinflationary impulse over the course of 2023. On top of that, and this is the big story in this cycle, we had a strong rebound in supply, both labor supply and capital supply. You might remember that right after the pandemic, and I'm sure a lot of you experienced this, there were tremendous issues in terms of supply chains. And that supply chain stress, in terms of logistics, in terms of transportation, meant that cost pressures were rising quite rapidly. That has eased significantly over the course of the past 12 months and has led to this strong disinflationary current. And then finally, the third point that is important to highlight in terms of disinflationary trends is the fact that we had labor markets around the world that were still very much supply constrained at the start of 2023, and we've continued to see very strong labor supply growth. The end of the pandemic, the fact that healthcare improvements were strong, the fact that childcare and elderly care were strongly available, and the fact that there was this strong labor demand all contributed to this favorable environment in terms of labor supply. And then in some regions around the world, you had rent disinflation, you also have still tight monetary policy, but all of those factors are the ideal combo to continue on this disinflationary trajectory. Now, as we look into 2024, I think there are 5 global themes that we should highlight. Number 1, we're going to be in an environment that is likely to show sub-trend global growth, but no major recession. Now, that does not mean that there aren't any economies that are susceptible to recession, and one of the ones that is most likely to continue being in a recession is that of Germany. But across the world, we're more likely than not to have an environment where growth is subdued but not recessionary. In Europe, we're looking at growth that is likely to still have a 0% handle, so 0.8, 0.9% growth. In the UK, the same type of momentum. You can see that in Asia, we're seeing slower economic momentum. China likely to grow around 4.5% despite policy efforts to stimulate growth. India is also cooling, and Latin America is also cooling. So we're likely to be in an environment where we continue to see this sub-trend growth. Nothing dramatic, but still an environment that leads to slower inflation and a rebalancing of global economic dynamics. The US economy may actually end up being one of the outperformers once again with 2% growth this year, but I'll let Ellen talk much more in detail about the US economy in a few minutes. Now, when we think about the second theme, we have to consider the possibility of having a wild ride in terms of potential headwinds and tailwinds in terms of global economic activity. I think that's where it becomes very critical for business leaders to be aware of those risks and plan different potential avenues, different potential scenarios, considering those risks. I think one of the amazing feats, globally speaking, is that global GDP recovered very rapidly from the pandemic. A lot of fiscal stimulus and monetary policy stimulus helped, but the recovery was quite amazing. Now, in a few economies, we've surpassed the pre-pandemic trend of economic activity. Latin America is a good example of that, where most economies are above their pre-COVID trend in terms of GDP growth. The US is not too far, about 1% below, and Europe is a little bit lagging, as is the rest of Asia, but I would argue that the Asian complex is more restrained because the pre-pandemic trend was quite strong, not so much because the recovery has been weaker, although you could argue that the Chinese case is an example of more subdued growth that is likely to be more of a structural issue rather than a cyclical issue. Now, the first headwind that we have to factor in is that of cost fatigue. Now, as economists, as academics, as policymakers, we often talk about inflation. But what really matters for a lot of private sector actors, whether it's consumers or corporate leaders, is cost levels, price levels. And what we've seen over the course of the past couple of years is a significant amount of cumulative inflation that we hadn't experienced over the course of the past 40 years. Inflation, up until recently, had been a non-issue. It wasn't something that people really talked about much, except in certain cases for gas prices, when there was an oil price shock, or other very specific items. Now, yes, we've seen a lot of very encouraging progress on the inflation front, and we're likely to see more of that coming through, but cost fatigue is likely to be a restraint in terms of consumers' spending power and willingness to spend in this environment, just like it is going to be a source of caution and scrutiny when it comes to business leaders going forward. Now, the other headwind that I think we have to be aware of is that of elevated cost of capital. Now, we are going to be in an environment where the cost of capital is likely to remain elevated for a prolonged period of time. We have seen central banks We have seen central banks start discussing the possibility of rate cuts, but if you look at most central banks around the world, they're still very much wary of easing monetary policy too soon before they're certain that inflation is back on a sustainable low trajectory. What that means is that we're still going to see the private sector, whether it's corporate leaders or consumers, exercise scrutiny when it comes to investment decisions, when it comes to buying decisions. That does not mean there's likely to be a retrenchment in private sector activity. It just means there's likely to be more caution. And even once central bankers start to ease monetary policy, it's unlikely that they'll bring rates back down to zero unless there's a major recessionary shock. So that means that overall, we should grow accustomed to an environment where the cost of capital is likely to be higher than it's been in the past, and that readjustment, that rebalancing on the cost of capital front is going to take a bit of time. Now, there are also tailwinds that I think we have to highlight that are quite positive in terms of economic momentum. I'm struggling with this clicker, going the wrong way. Apologies. One of the main tailwinds in terms of economic momentum is that of the labor market. We have a labor market across the world that remains quite tight. We've seen unemployment rates in most major regions of the world fall to record lows or multi-decade lows. The US is a prime example, with the unemployment rate being currently close to a 50-year low. Now, the combination of an environment where most people that want to work are employed and an environment where wage growth has accelerated and most recently surpassed inflation means that real income growth continues to be a driver of consumer spending activity. That's this type of sustainable consumer spending trends that you want to have in a balanced economy. Now, as we look ahead into 2024, we're likely to see a little bit of a softening in labor demand because of this cooler prospects for economic activity, but we're not expecting a retrenchment. And I always come back to the value of talent. I think one of the key characteristics of COVID is that it's shifted the way we perceive the value of talent. Because it was so hard for business leaders to hire, train, and retain the right type of talent post-pandemic, that has meant that we are not seeing the type of broad-based layoffs that we typically see ahead of any economic slowdown. Instead, what we're seeing is strategic hiring decisions, sometimes hiring freezes, and strategic layoff decisions, which means that while there might be a slight uptick in unemployment rates around the world, it's unlikely that we'll see a major retrenchment in the labor market, which in turn means that income support should remain positive and support consumer spending growth going forward. The other tailwind that I think we have to factor is the fact that in this environment where we have what I've called a globally supply fragile environment, we're likely to see more and more focus by corporate entities on driving stronger productivity growth. Now, I know what you're going to say. You're just going to talk about all the hype around Gen AI. That's part of the story, but I think the issue is broader than that. We've seen an environment where, because there isn't that desire to get rid of talent at the first sign of an economic slowdown, you have to find ways to offset the cost of that talent and that cost fatigue element that I was just highlighting. So we're seeing a lot of businesses take advantage of potential investment decisions to try to increase productivity of processes, but also, and importantly, integrate technology into this effort to improve productivity growth. And we've been looking at Gen AI as a potential source of stronger growth. I think the first leg of Gen AI is likely to come from stronger capital investment in the data infrastructure, investment in the software, investment in cybersecurity, in the regulatory framework, but also investment in company adopting these new technologies, which is likely to generate an initial benefit in terms of economic activity. And then after that, we should start to see stronger productivity growth. And we estimate that the combination of both stronger capital investment and stronger productivity growth over the next decade could add $1 trillion to the US economy in terms of GDP, additional GDP output. In an optimistic case, you could see $2 trillion of additional output. That's about 7% of GDP. But it's not just a US story, it's also a global story. It's a global story where that benefit could range from anywhere from 2 to $3.5 trillion globally in terms of additional output and more productive output, which is really what we need today, is that non-inflationary type of growth that productivity can deliver. Now, when we think about the third topic, the third theme for 2024, I think it's going to be one in which we see inflation continuing to cool across the world. It's going to be a gradual process, a process in which we see a lot of disinflationary currents in many economies around the world, but one that takes a bit more time than it did because of some of the stickiness, especially when it comes to service sector inflation. Really struggling with this. So as you can see here, most economies around the world are expected to experience ongoing disinflation going into the rest of the year. I mentioned some of the factors that are likely to still be present, but we're going to be in an environment where we're likely to have the ideal combo when it comes to disinflationary pressures in 2024. Moderating final demand growth, an environment where there is a little bit more price sensitivity and less pricing power, an environment where productivity is very much part of the picture, stronger productivity growth, an environment where in some economies you continue to see disinflationary pressures from reduced shelter cost inflation, US, Canada, UK being the prime examples, and very importantly, an environment where central banks are likely to be more cautious when it comes to loosening monetary policy. Why? Because they were burnt on the upside when it came to tightening monetary policy in the face of inflation. They're more likely to be more gradual, more cautious in easing monetary policy. If you look at inflation data in most economies around the world, whether it's advanced economies or emerging markets, you're in an environment that would otherwise suggest it's time for policy easing. But I think what we're going to see in most advanced economies, at least, is a holding pattern that is a little bit longer than what markets are expecting. Whether it's the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England, the Bank of Canada, we're going to see central bankers be a little bit more cautious when it comes to easing monetary policy. So our assumption across these major economies is about 100 basis points of rate cuts over the course of 2024. Now, markets in most of these economies are pricing 150, 175 basis points of rate cuts starting very early, in March for the Fed, in April for the ECB, and the same for the Bank of England. That might not necessarily be the case because, again, there is that fear of easing too early and having to backtrack in terms of easing. It may not be the optimal policy decision, but that's what we think is still most likely in this environment where inflation is still very much a fear that many central bankers have in the back of their minds. Now, the fifth theme and the final theme is that of fiscal consolidation and geopolitically restrained trade. We're likely to be in an environment where, because interest rates are higher, the debt servicing costs for government are going to be a key area of focus. And debt sustainability is going to be one of the factors that restrains fiscal expansion in a number of major economies. You could see it in the US, you can see it in Europe, where there is a little bit more restraint, a little bit more caution when it comes to spending more and to increasing deficits, and as a result, debt levels across these economies. Now, that means a little bit less fiscal support. I think the US is a prime example where government spending in the US last year contributed about 30% of GDP growth. That's a big contribution from a sector that represents roughly half of that 30%, double the size of its, double the contribution relative to its size. And you're seeing that across a number of economies. Europe is another prime example where there is still going to be support from the EU Recovery Fund across a number of economies, but there is more attention towards debt levels and deficit levels. Germany is a key example there, where there was recently a decision not to expand the budget beyond some of the rules that the country has. Geopolitically restrained trade is also very important to keep in mind, because in a globally supply-fragile world, you're going to be in an environment where there's a lot more attention to supply chains. And any disruptions like what we're seeing in the Red Sea right now could have amplified effects across the world. In the case of the Red Sea, is most likely going to first affect European trade, but it could have knock-on effects to the rest of the world and to the US if it's more prolonged and more fluid situation that evolves. Now, what I also wanted to do, beyond the 5 themes that are key for 2024, is focus on some of the key regions of the world. So in terms of the Canadian economy, we're likely to be in an environment where we continue to see pressures in terms of debt servicing costs. One of the key characteristics of the Canadian economy is that a lot of the debt is actually at variable rates. It's not at fixed rates, especially on the mortgage side. That means that consumers and homeowners have to refinance at the higher rates today than they had a few years back. That puts pressure on their spending power. If you combine that with an environment in which you have cost fatigue and where you have a higher cost of debt for other types of consumer loans, that's likely to restrain economic activity. And Canada is one of those examples where, despite the US growing at 2.5% last year, Canada is likely to only manage 0.9% growth, so a fairly subdued pace of growth last year. And this year, we're expecting growth to be around 0.7%. So subdued economic activity, restrained by cost fatigue and debt servicing costs that are likely to be two of the key facets of the Canadian economy. Now, we're also expecting inflation to ease, as you can see here, but it's going to be a more gradual process, and that will allow the Bank of Canada to gradually ease monetary policy by 100 basis points before the end of the year. One key element that I have to add when it comes to the Canadian economy is that labor supply has been rising very strongly, in part due to policies driving stronger immigration. That is positive, but it's also a question of absorption. And what we're seeing in Canada is that there's a difficulty of absorption of immigration, which has led to an uptick in the unemployment rate, and that's likely to continue in an environment where you have subdued GDP growth under 1%. Now, the European economies are quite interesting because for the Eurozone, we've seen stagnation over the last 12 to 18 months, but it's not been homogeneous at all. The former leaders in Europe are now laggards, and the former laggards are now leaders in terms of economic growth, economic momentum. I mentioned that Germany is most likely in a recession. It contracted over the entirety of 2023 in terms of GDP growth. It's likely, unfortunately, to experience another year of contraction in 2024, and that is because of its structure, more energy sensitive, as well as more industrialized than other economies that are faring better. The Spain, Italy, Greece, that you might remember were the center of attention during the sovereign debt crisis back in 2013, 2014, are now the leaders in terms of economic momentum, backed by strong spending on the services side. Now, yes, there is still going to be that positive momentum driving growth for these economies, but it's likely that we see a rebalancing. So Germany gradually rebounding, gradually re-accelerating, and some of these economies, southern economies, actually decelerating in terms of economic momentum. The key story here is going to be the fact that lower inflation is going to provide more impetus for real wage growth, and the lower energy environment, lower energy price environment is going to sustain stronger competitiveness for European economies. That's likely to drive a gradual acceleration of economic momentum in the Eurozone, but again, we're not expecting growth to surpass 1% after a 0.5% advance in 2023. The ECB, as I said, is likely to be very cautious when it comes to easing monetary policy. We heard from President Lagarde a couple of days ago that she reiterated the fact that the ECB is going to be cautious when it comes to easing monetary policy. There's likely a desire to see whether the Fed moves in March before the ECB makes a decision for a potential April rate cut. But if it does not cut in April, it will likely decide to cut in June. The economic fundamentals and inflation fundamentals would suggest that actually the ECB could go first when it comes to easing monetary policy, because the combo of slower inflation and an environment where economic activity is more subdued would make the case for more rapid easing in the Eurozone. Now, Japan's the interesting story. Japan has outperformed expectations. Japan was one of these outperformers that I talked about earlier in terms of the global economic outperformance. It started 2023 very strong. Interestingly enough, Japan has been coming out of 2 decades of deflation. So the early stages of inflation was actually potentially positive in terms of economic momentum. You might ask why? Well, if you're in a deflation environment where prices are falling, you tend to postpone spending, postpone investment because things are going to be cheaper the next day. If inflation turns positive, initially, that might actually drive more activity because you want to take advantage of prices before they rise further. But now we're in a different environment. We're in an environment where inflation has been hovering around 3 to 4% in Japan, which is something that is a complete different paradigm when it comes to 2 years of deflation before that. And that is leading to a very complex situation for many consumers and many businesses uncertain as to how to react to this environment. So we've seen this hit to spending power, restrain consumer spending as of the end of the last year, slowing consumer spending momentum, and CapEx investment has been restrained both by the higher cost of goods as well as the higher cost of labor, with wage negotiations underway, pushing up wage growth, but also a globally restrained environment when it comes to export potential for the Japanese economy, which is highly dependent on exports, especially with the Chinese economy slowing. So this is going to be a picture where we see moderate momentum going into this year, probably growth around 1% after a 2% advance. And the Bank of Japan is actually likely to move in the opposite direction as other central banks, tightening monetary policy, likely exiting its negative policy rate environment and its yield curve control to try to offset some of the risk from inflation. Now, the Chinese economy is also one that I think is quite interesting. There are really a couple of cyclical and structural headwinds that we have to factor and take into consideration. A couple of important headwinds that we have to take into consideration are, from a cyclical perspective, slower consumer spending, reduced industrial activity, and ongoing property sector concerns. The combo of these has meant that the authorities have had to act to stimulate growth. But I think more importantly, we're in an environment where China is no longer going to be the global engine of growth that it once was. We're in an environment where structurally the population is aging and is shrinking. The population shrank by about 2.5 million over the last couple of years. It's aging rapidly. We have excess savings, so people are saving too much and not spending enough because there isn't that social safety net. And we have an environment in which the unemployment rate, especially for the younger generation, is excessively high. Very interesting stat. If you look at the youth unemployment, it was around 20-25%, then they stopped publishing it, and they just republished it, and it's now 15%. So something happened over the past 6 months that we're not aware of. Just in the interest of time, I'll skip India and Latin America, and happy to answer any questions during our conversation. But I wanted to conclude with 5 lessons that I think are important to highlight when it comes to the global landscape and how best to navigate that from a business perspective. I think the first lesson that is important to remember is understand where you play and play where you understand. That means that it's not just about your first client, your first supplier, it's about the entire ecosystem in which you're evolving. Because developments in Taiwan, in the Middle East, in Europe can have direct consequences, even if your market is local, because it's supply chains that are affected, inflation that is affected, that could disrupt your potential for doing business. The second lesson that is important to understand is scenarios are your friend. I think I was clear that we have a baseline that is nuanced in terms of global economic activity. We're in a year of rebalancing, but there are a number of potential tailwinds or headwinds that could influence the baseline up or down. So building scenarios and developing those and using those to your advantage is very important. The third is be realistic. Yes, there's a lot of enthusiasm. The US is a prime example where the recent data in terms of lower inflation, stronger growth is very, very positive. We have the holy grail of non-inflationary growth as of the end of 2023. But we have to be conscious that things can turn, and it's not because one data set is positive that it will continue to be so. So be realistic about the outlook. Number 4, you can't price your way out of this situation anymore. That was 21 and 22. Nowadays, you have to consider the increased price sensitivity when it comes to pricing power, and supply matters. Supply did not matter pre-COVID, it matters a lot today. And then finally, don't hold your breath, start swimming. What does that mean? Well, we're likely to be in a higher cost of capital environment for the foreseeable future. So you should not delay investment decisions because the cost of capital is high. Instead, you should seize the opportunities that you see today, because for the first time in about 4 years, central banks are not going to be raising rates, but they're going to be cutting rates. So even if it costs a lot more to invest today, you're likely to be able to refinance over the coming years, and you should not miss out on potential opportunities. So on that more positive note, I'll end and pass the baton on to Ellen for the economics section. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Greg. So our second panelist is Ellen Zentner. Ellen is Chief U.S. Economist at Morgan Stanley, a Managing Director and a member of its Research Diversity and Inclusion Council. She joined the firm in 2013 from Nomura Securities International. From 2003 to 2011, Ellen worked for the Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi UFJ as its Senior U.S. Economist, and before joining BTMU, she worked in the Revenue Estimating Division at the Texas State Comptroller. Ellen is president of the National Association for Business Economics and currently serves on the Treasury Borrowing Advisory Committee, as well as the Geoeconomic Council of Advisors for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She sits on the Economic Advisory Panel for the American Bankers Association and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Please join me in welcoming Ellen Zentner to the 2024 Business Forecast Luncheon. Ellen?
Here we go. Boy, how about that bio? You gotta wonder if I do any actual work. I'm really honored to be here, and I understand it's the 30th anniversary of this event, which is just incredible. And when Mervin asked me to come down and speak, I looked at the illustrious list of people that preceded myself and Greg in speaking here every year, and I thought, my gosh, I've got to take this opportunity. Even Janet Yellen speaking in the past. So that's very impressive. And I also want to say, where's Bill, our Dow Jones guy? Yeah. Want some investment advice after this. Because if you got that right, I wonder, the first thing Greg and I said to each other was, did you put your money where your mouth was? I hope. But we definitely, economists need investment advice. We're great at a lot of things. We're not great at predicting markets. So if you were going to write on your green question card, what's the S&P 500 at the end of this year? I'm not going to be the one to answer it. I'll give that to you, Greg. And take his answer with a grain of salt. So a big grain of salt. All right, so I'm going to try this here clicker, and I understand there is a delay. But I'm going to dive more into the U.S. economic outlook, and you're going to hear some overlapping themes with Greg. Okay. The first thing I learned in school was when you create a PowerPoint presentation, don't put a lot of words on the slide. And so as soon as I got out of school, I put a lot of words on the slide. So listen to my words, as any good parent would say, because you may not even be able to read a lot of what's on the screen. So one of the things that we finally did was try to quantify the fiscal impulse in GDP versus the monetary policy drag. Because one of the biggest questions has been, hadn't all of that government stimulus made the Fed's job more difficult? And the answer is yes, it has. Up until just the fourth quarter of last year, the fiscal impulse was overcoming any drag we were seeing from monetary policy. And so the Fed was raising rates rapidly, and it felt like it wasn't having an impact on the economy. Of course, it was on housing. We ended up having the largest housing recession on record. Importantly, it did not spill over into home valuations, but activity was down more than 25%. So we knew the Fed's policies were working on the very interest rate sensitive sectors of the economy, but you just, frustratingly for the Fed, you weren't seeing a big impact in terms of slowing the economy overall. But we still had a good deal of government stimulus sloshing around the system. So the light green bars there go from very positive contribution to now a negative contribution to GDP going forward. Those are just government transfers. We had the largest stimulus program from COVID only expired in March of last year. We had 42 million Americans that were maxed out on 18 different assistance programs. And it's because COVID had lowered the barrier to entry for those programs. And so when that expired in March, a good deal of folks got booted off of those programs. And so those government transfers have now turned into a drag on GDP. And then you have just general government spending from the infrastructure package that was passed, state and local governments doing a good deal of infrastructure spending around the US. And so that's been a positive contribution to GDP. That gets smaller going forward. So what I'm going to tell you for the U.S. economy is really trying to paint a picture of why growth is slowing, but not falling off a cliff. And I think it's that falling off a cliff part that's the most important, and why Greg and I both are optimistic on the U.S. economy. We both don't believe that we're going to repeat the growth rates of last year, but there's a lot of good support for the U.S. economy and the U.S. outlook, and one reason why we're still calling for a soft landing in this economy. And I will say, what does soft landing mean to an economist? It just means no recession. So none of the incoming data, nor the forward-looking data tell me that the economy is going to be falling off a cliff. Unusual to send an optimistic message, right, for an economist? We're supposed to be the dismal scientists, but I'm going to try to sound optimistic today. Okay, I did hit the button once. I know we're on a delay for the slides. There we go. Just have to be patient. That's hard for me. My husband will tell you. So here is a look state by state. And Mervin's going to get into the Arkansas economy. But when I'm looking at the business cycle from the national level, I like to look at these maps that the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank puts out each month. And it takes state-level data, like income and spending and jobs and housing and manufacturing at the state level, and builds it into one summary statistic, state by state, to give a sense of, are states expanding, are they contracting, how much are they expanding, how much are they contracting? And on the right-hand side, you can see that in January of last year, all 50 states were in expansion. And you'll never be able to read the legend here, but green is good, light green is still good. You get into the lighter colors, you get into the orange and red, and that's contraction. And so all of the states were in expansion in January last year. By November of last year, which is the chart on the left, about half of the states were still in expansion. And so what we're seeing is broad-based slowdown across the U.S. economy. And that's still an optimistic message, right? We need a broad-based slowing in the economy. We need it to ensure that inflationary pressures remain low and stable. We need it to ensure, therefore, that the Fed sees that it has done enough. And indeed, the next move will be down in rates and not up. I will tell you that one of the interesting things about using these maps is that there are very idiosyncratic factors that can happen in any given month to a particular state. So, for example, back in 2019, when we were in the midst of the U.S.-China trade dispute, we're not allowed to say war, so it was a trade dispute. It was a kerfuffle. It was a strong disagreement between U.S. and China. And at one point, Kentucky popped into the red. What is that? China stopped buying bourbon. And China is a big source of demand for Kentucky bourbon. Around that same time, all of a sudden, Maine popped into the red. What happened? They stopped buying lobster. And so, it makes a big difference to any given state. And so these maps also help in trying to understand what idiosyncratic factors might be going on for a particular state. In fact, at that time, I think what we did was we drew a line under the ocean and said, no lobster from the U.S. will cross that line into Canada and go into China. No. You have to buy it from the U.S. Anyhow, so these maps are really helpful. And I will tell you that generally you will see further weakening, more of the states are turning red, and that starts to grow and spread across the country when we think about, are we actually approaching recession? There are times when we were all in the green and then all of a sudden we're all in the red. You can imagine COVID was one of those times. And so this map is not going to help you if a pandemic is going to hit. But it can help you when you're thinking about regular cyclical factors that might take place. So it offsets some of that slowing. But who's been doing the spending? Wealthy. So these bars, if you just look far out to the right, that's 2021 and 2022. Now we have 2023 full year data. The top income quintile has been doing all of the spending in the US. 45% of all consumer spending in the last couple years has been the top income quintile. If you add the top 2 income quintiles, it's more than 60% of all consumer spending. And that is why we were too low on our GDP forecast last year. It was because we didn't think that that excess savings rate being held by the wealthiest households was going to be finally, let me touch on government debt, because I want to scare you in the last slide, because it's really my job. I'm supposed to stand up here and be all downtrodden and downbeat as an economist and really scare you and give you some indigestion after you've had your nice lunch. And so I'm going to try to end on government debt. Just the mention of government debt should give you indigestion. And so this shows that we're at about 122% debt to GDP ratio right now. That's already well higher than what very, very smart economists have studied across global economies and said that 90%, when you exceed 90% debt to GDP, you start to lower your long-run growth in the economy. And why is that? Because eventually you have to get your fiscal house in order, and that means fiscal consolidation. Austerity means tough choices have to be made. And I can't remember the last administration that actually made tough choices. And so this just shows where that debt to GDP ratio is going to go under various interest rate assumptions, because it's the interest that we pay on our debt that is a real problem. Today we're paying about 2.6%, 2.7% average interest rate on debt, government debt, and that's only going up. If we go back to pre-GFC average interest on debt, you're talking about only about 140% debt to GDP ratio that we get to. If you take what the market is pricing in, we're going to get up to about 150-something% of debt to GDP. So it means that because we know interest rates are going to continue to increase, that is going to, when you think about debt consolidation and how much you need to do, it's going to matter. It's going to matter what interest you're paying on your debt, because that's going to determine just how much austerity you need to put into place. It is an unsustainable issue in the U.S. And not one that I'm confident we're going to tackle real soon. But I think it's worth bringing into the discussion. So thank you very much. There's your outlook for the U.S.
All right, thank you, Ellen. Now it's my pleasure to introduce someone who needs no introduction, Mervin Jebaraj. Mervin is the director of the Center for Business and Economic Research. He is an exceptional source of business and economics-related expertise that journalists and business people alike rely on to understand how national and regional issues impact the state of Arkansas. His work is regularly noted by the state's business media. Arkansas Business and the Northwest Arkansas Business Journal recognize Mervin in their 40 under 40 list and on the Arkansas 250 list. Mervin is a member of the board of directors of the National Association of Business Economics and the Northwest Arkansas National Airport. Please join me in welcoming Mervin to the podium. Mervin, come on up.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Ooh, that was loud. Wake up. It's always a challenge hearing 3 economists in a row after you eat lunch, right? but we had some good ones. Thank you, Curtis. Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Alan. We had a great cast of characters for our 30th annual business forecast, right? Yeah, thank you, thank you. I know we don't look a day over 29, too, so. And they've given you a nice parting gift, no recession in 2024, so I don't know what else you could ask for here. I think my job is done. I should just get down and move on. Let's see if this works. It works for now. Oh, too fast, almost. All right. I'm going to talk about the Arkansas economy. There's a lot to talk about, and I like to talk a lot, so let's see how much I can get through here. But we'll start with the overall look at the Arkansas economy. This is real GDP. This is the state's gross output adjusted for inflation. And you saw the stats for the U.S. The GDP figures were a lot stronger than what you're seeing on this chart here, where you'll see that the orange line pretty much is very close to zero. So the most recent quarters that we have data for, we had a negative 0.4% decrease in GDP and then a 0.7% increase in GDP. And so that compares with what the nation as a whole was doing, which was a little above 2% and then 4.9% for those respective quarters. So if you're asking what's going on in Arkansas in particular, most of this decline that we saw, or slower growth that we saw in the last couple of quarters, had to do with a slowdown, a dramatic slowdown in the ag industry in Arkansas. So coming into 2023, the ag industry's output was about $3 billion. The most recent quarter that we have data for in Arkansas, the ag industry is now $1.3 billion. So a dramatic decline in the ag industry dragged the state's overall GDP down. So I did what you shouldn't do as an economist, which is remove one sector and then pretend it doesn't exist. And then look at the rest of the state economy, which is that blue line. So I took ag out, which is, I'm going to get run out of here. See, I said I tried to take ag out and they cut the mic already. You can't do that in Arkansas, apparently. So, but if you tried it, what you'll see is that the state's GDP then grew by 2% and 3.5%. So still not as strong for those respective quarters as the national GDP, but better than negative 0.4 and 0.7. So that's the overall picture. Ag had a difficult year in Arkansas, and that impacted some sectors, as we'll see through the rest of this presentation. But in a bit of good news, once again, the state's unemployment rate remains fairly low. We entered 2023 at 3.4% unemployment rate. We went all the way down to 2.6%, which is the new record low unemployment rate for the state of Arkansas. We stayed there for 2 months this summer, and then we saw a gradual increase in the unemployment rate, much as we saw at the national level. So we're still a little bit lower than the national unemployment rate, but 3.4% from any historical perspective for our state is still fairly low unemployment rate. And all of our metro areas had very low unemployment rates through the year as well. So at the very bottom, that's Northwest Arkansas, is 2.3% unemployment rate right now. At the very top there is Pine Bluff, which has a 4.3% unemployment rate. You'll see that they follow the state. We had record low unemployment rates in most of our metro areas in the summer when the state had the record low unemployment rate. And then you see a gradual increase in some of our metro areas. So Northwest Arkansas, too, went to a record low unemployment rate. We finally beat that 1999 record low unemployment rate, not because percentage-wise we actually went lower, but because they revised 1999's data up. So 2.0 is the new record low unemployment rate for Northwest Arkansas, and we got there this summer. And so you look at the extremely low unemployment rate. We talked about this when we talked about labor force participation. Both Greg and Ellen mentioned this. You look at this, this shows you the labor force in Arkansas compared to February of 2020. So this is right before the pandemic. Things were still good back then. We had a great business forecast that year too. We were expecting a roaring year. It just ended up being a roaring COVID year. But you look at back then to where we are today, almost every metro area and the state as a whole has more people working or looking for work. So we have low unemployment rate, more people working and looking for work. And yet when I speak to small business owners in our state, their number one complaint is, I can't find anybody to work for me. And I think the problem that we see happening is that larger businesses or businesses that are offering higher wages and more benefits are able to poach workers from smaller businesses, and smaller businesses are forced to, if they can, raise wages significantly to try to compete with larger businesses. So some of you know this, some of you have heard of this. They opened a new Buc-ee's in Springfield. Some of you know. Some of you are so excited you drove 2 hours to go see a new gas station, I think, right? I looked this up the other day. They're paying $21 an hour to mind their meat station. $21, 401k match, and all the brisket scraps you can get. Good luck hiring people here. Okay, that giant sucking sound you hear is Buc-ee's vacuuming up all your employees now. There's my Ross Perot reference for you. Yes, I know who Ross Perot is. Let's look at payroll growth in Arkansas. We added about 15,000 jobs last year, much lower than the previous 2 years, but most of that was a COVID distortion. We lost several thousand jobs. We added them back over the next 2 years. So in any normal year, if we had 15,000 jobs increase, that was a good year for Arkansas. An average year would be about 10, 11,000 jobs. Good years that we've had in the past have been between 15 and 17,000 jobs year over year. So we had a good year. We grew by about 15,000 jobs, and we'll look at which sectors and so on here in a little bit. But if you pay very close attention to, again, so we had that record low unemployment rate, and we saw the unemployment rate go up. And so starting in September of last year, we saw that we've been losing jobs in the Arkansas economy. So since September, you could argue that Arkansas has been on a losing streak. And no, I'm not talking about the Hogs. What do you say about that season anyway, football? We could call it a wreck, a total loss, right? But it's a good thing then we've added someone to our coaching staff that has experiences in wrecks, in the aftermaths of wrecks, and a total loss. For those of you that don't know, you should Google Bobby Petrino and wreck, and you'll be up to date in a second. I got more, okay? All right, so we did appoint him on November 29th, and sure enough, in December, jobs started going back up. So, you know, talk about the end of the Razorback vibe recession. We're back, baby, we're back. All right, so where do we actually see job growth last year? Construction. Now, we obviously have the half-cent sales tax for roads and bridges, et cetera, made permanent, and you see a lot of construction activity all around our state. The leisure and hospitality industry, we've seen a lot of job increases here. It took a while after the pandemic to get the jobs back here. Most of the people that were working in this industry went on to other industries. But we're seeing in Arkansas, for example, a 28% increase in wages in the leisure and hospitality industry. So it was $13 an hour before the pandemic in February of 2020. That was about $2 more than the Arkansas minimum wage. Today, that's $17 and change. So still not as good as Buc-ee's meat minder, but still fairly high wages in the leisure and hospitality industry. We've seen a lot of growth in education and healthcare. Education services, especially tutoring programs, technical schools, certificate programs, that has grown quite a bit. A lot of growth in healthcare that Curtis alluded to earlier. We'll talk about other services. What exactly is in other services? Some of that is nail salons and hairdressers. I got a new haircut last week, so there's a lot more jobs in there. And then you see those next few sectors where you didn't see a whole lot of growth across our state because you saw some job losses in those sectors throughout the year. So, and then at the very bottom, you see mining and logging. Again, that has been losing jobs for several years at this point. And information, which we're going to talk about some more in the next few slides. So, my forecast for the Arkansas economy is about 10 to 10,500 jobs in the next year. So last year we had a good year. This year we're going to have an average year. So we're not losing jobs net in the state. We're still growing, but not at the pace we were in the last couple of years. And if we want to get a clue as to where those jobs are coming from, this is a chart showing business establishment growth in Arkansas. And so we've talked about the level of federal assistance programs available to households and businesses in the last couple of years that has spurred a new level of business formation in the United States and here in Arkansas. So you're seeing well over 3% growth year over year in the number of businesses being formed. This is how many applications for new businesses in what we call high propensity businesses. These are businesses very likely to hire people or have wages attached to their application. So they're not your sole proprietors. This is not your Uber driver. These are people starting businesses and will hire people. And you can see that before the pandemic, we had about 9,000 applications each year in this category. Now we're well above 12,000 applications. So take a look at which sectors we're seeing this business application growth. I put only the sectors here that grew 3% year over year since the pandemic. And at the very top there, you see information, which has been cut off at the top. That's because they're so high, they were skewing this chart, so I cut it off. And I thought we have suddenly a lot of tech jobs and new tech companies based in Arkansas, so I had put a call into the AEDC to try to figure out what was going on, because I hadn't seen this. As it turns out, these are mostly remote jobs, so these are people that moved to the state of Arkansas that are working for companies based elsewhere, but those companies filed paperwork in the state to pay UI and for other tax reasons. So it shows up as a big increase in business establishments in the information sector. So these aren't necessarily companies formed here, but there are a lot of people that work in the tech sector that are now in Arkansas. And you see a fairly dramatic decline there towards the end. This is because a lot of companies are now starting to call their workers back, or at least require that they be in the office 2 or 3 times a week. So we've lost some of those remote workers in the last year, which is why in the previous slide you saw information sector was negative. That's not necessarily because we lost a lot of tech jobs that are native to Arkansas, so much as it was people that were working in that sector went back to the states where their employer was. I want to point out a couple of other ones that did do well during the pandemic and then since declined. One of them is truck transportation. Again, with all the supply chain shortages, a lot of people bought rigs and joined the trucking industry, and now there's a bit of an excess capacity there, and they're leaving, which is why you see a decline there. And then the sector that says fire, which is finance, insurance, real estate, was on fire during the pandemic, is no longer on fire, and you see some people exiting that industry as well. So the places where we're going to continue to see growth are construction. So we're seeing new construction businesses. There is a lot of demand for construction, both public sector and private sector construction. We don't expect there to be a slowdown in the construction sector anytime soon. There's still a lot of projects backlogged. So we'll see a lot more job growth there. Educational services. So this is not just technical schools. It's not just certificate programs, but we've seen a lot more growth in K through 12 tutoring programs. So people are putting the children through tutoring programs throughout K through 12, in addition to college prep tutoring and things like that. And then I did say I will talk about other services, so we'll have to talk about other services. This one, I was scratching my head. It wasn't nail salons, and it wasn't hairdressers that really grew. It's that other most common business, all up and down 71B. Anyone want to take a guess? Car washes. That's exactly right. Now, when I first started seeing car washes pop up everywhere, my first thought, I'd watch Breaking Bad like the rest of you, was I was thinking, surely they're laundering something other than cars here. But as it turns out, car washes are a very profitable business. There's a lot of private equity involved in investing in new car washes. They have low overhead. Doesn't take a lot of labor to run a car wash. And the most profitable thing about them is that they're able to sell club memberships to car washes. I never could understand this. Why would you buy a membership to a car wash club? Like, I understand mountain biking clubs. We have those. People join them. We have running clubs. People join those. There are beer drinking clubs. People join those. Well, to be fair, running clubs and beer drinking clubs are the same thing, I think. But car washing clubs is the new thing. These car washes sell memberships. People apparently take their cars more than once a month at that point. I don't know why, but there must be some really clean cars driving around. I'm going to go to the parking lot and check after this to see if that's true. So that's actually been a very big growth industry here. The other thing that you see a lot of it on 71B, it's a great way to hold on to high-value real estate that cash flows really well. So at some point when our region gets through their plans for what they want 71B to be, you'll see all of a sudden those car washes disappear and there's going to be mixed-use development on there. So enjoy the car wash for now. So really quickly, let's look at what's going on at the different metro areas across our state. Here in Central Arkansas, you saw growth of about 4,000 jobs. So again, like the state, grew through the first part of the year, and then about after the summer, you saw a decline in employment there through some of the same sectors that we just talked about. So that followed 10,000 jobs in the previous year, 16,500 jobs in the year before that. So where did we see growth and where did we see declines in employment in Central Arkansas? Again, the leisure and hospitality industry. So this is still catching up from the pandemic. So that's what we're seeing happening here. Construction in Central Arkansas as well. There are as many orange cones there as there are here. Education and health services, particularly health services, a very big and important sector in Central Arkansas. These are other services, so you do have nail salons and hairdressers, but a lot of car washes in Central Arkansas too. And then you see much smaller growth in manufacturing, trade, transportation, utilities, because we did have job losses in both those sectors, especially in the truck transportation piece of it. And at the very bottom, you see, again, information declined. Again, most of that has to do with remote workers. And then financial activities. This is a big sector in Central Arkansas, and we can all say that 2023 ended pretty well, but there was a long part of 2023 when regional banks were under severe pressure, and that thankfully is no longer true. Looking around the rest of our state and seeing what we have going on, we have in Fort Smith a small increase in jobs, about 500 jobs added year over year, which followed fairly strong growth of 3.2 and 1.7 thousand jobs in the previous years. What you're seeing in Fort Smith, again, Curtis alluded to this, is the new mission that the air base there has spurred a lot of construction, so a lot of jobs in the construction industry, a lot of jobs in manufacturing as well, and a lot of jobs in leisure and hospitality. And if you look at the trajectory that Fort Smith is on, they're actually getting a lot closer to getting to where they were right around the middle of the last recession. So they're getting to somewhere like 2008, 2009 levels, and they'll probably get there slowly, but over the next few years. What you see in Jonesboro, surprising, this is usually the other metro area that does really well in our state, which is a no job growth in Jonesboro in 2023. This in large part, again, they had job growth through the first part of the year, and then you saw declines in the second part of the year. As I talked about in my first slide, we had a downturn in the agricultural economy in our state. There is a lot of agriculture-related manufacturing in Jonesboro, and that's where we saw losses in jobs. The service sector, education, healthcare, we've added jobs in those sectors in Jonesboro, so most of those have to do with those agribusiness manufacturing jobs. And then if you look at Hot Springs, again, a small decline in jobs. The Hot Springs hospitality industry is improving, but is struggling to compete with, even Jonesboro has a convention center and getting a lot of activity there. Central Arkansas here at this convention center, we are in Northwest Arkansas. So Hot Springs is losing out what used to be its bread and butter, which is tourism, especially business conferences and the convention industry there. So there still needs to be quite a bit more investment in their hotels there to get that infrastructure up to make it a destination that it used to be. And then finally, Pine Bluff, again, you see no job growth year over year. Previous years was a decline and a small increase. Again, you saw job losses in the manufacturing sector in Pine Bluff, small increase in jobs in the private service producing sector. So there's some impact from tourism for that casino, but not enough to turn the tide and produce more jobs in Pine Bluff. Which brings me to Northwest Arkansas. We had 10,000 jobs added in 2023. That followed, previous year was 16,000 jobs and then 15,000 jobs. Both of those were sort of distorted by COVID. So 10,000 jobs is still stronger growth than we saw before the pandemic. And we're trying to figure out where those jobs were. Again, huge amount of jobs in construction. The roads are all torn up. The airport is torn up. There are new buildings going up everywhere. All kinds of construction jobs, leisure and hospitality. Yes, in spite of that terrible Razorback football season, we still had an increase in leisure and hospitality. Again, because wages have gone up and this sector is now catching back up in terms of employment. Other services, so really putting leisure and hospitality together and other services, these are all your chicken shops and car washes, which is, again, one of the plot points in Breaking Bad. Now, all our businesses are legit here. Government sector, massive increase in jobs. All of this is school teachers, basically. So we've hired a lot of school teachers here in Northwest Arkansas. Education and health services, a good mix here in healthcare, as well as those tutoring programs I was talking about, professional business services. We're still seeing an increase in remote jobs in this particular sector. So some computer science jobs, you're still seeing an increase in remote jobs here in Northwest Arkansas, in addition to just an increase in the numbers of all of you here, lawyers, accountants, engineers, and so on. Small increase in manufacturing, financial activities. So our real estate sector also slowed, so you see no increase. At the very bottom, information is what we talked about earlier. And my forecast for Northwest Arkansas is an addition of about 5,500 jobs next year. Where do we expect to see that growth? In professional business services, in the construction industry, and yes, in leisure and hospitality industry. Why do I expect jobs to go up in the leisure and hospitality industry? It's because I'm expecting good things from the Hogs next year in football. I think we're going to ride into next year with our heads held high because we got a neck brace to go with it. I think I'm done with these. I might have a few more. Our population growth has been fairly stellar. You can Google neck brace and Bobby Petrino and you'll get there quickly too. Our population growth has been fairly stellar in Northwest Arkansas, a lot faster than what we had before the pandemic. A lot of this had to do with remote workers coming into our region, and I think we're going to see, as we've seen, some of those workers are going back to where they came from. We're going to see population growth still remain at the 9, 10, 11,000 level, but probably not at the 13,000 level that we've seen in the past couple of years. Some of the evidence for this, the number of homes sold has declined here in Northwest Arkansas, so we are back to 2017, 2018 levels of home sales. Unfortunately, we're not back to 2017, 2018 levels of prices. Home prices have not declined yet in Northwest Arkansas. The increase is much smaller than it was, so it's no longer going up 15, 20, 30% year over year. It's now only going up 8, 7, 9%. So that's what the increase we saw in 2017, 2018 when affordability was still a concern. So it remains a concern here in Northwest Arkansas. And that is the end of both my presentation and my Bobby Petrino references.
That was the reaction to the Bobby Petrino references right there. So while Mervin is taking his seat, we'll now move on to our panel discussion part of our program. And I have a wide variety of questions and topics I do want to cover with our experts and really maybe go down another layer for some of the items that they've already talked about. But we want your questions as well. So again, hopefully you've filled in a question on the green index cards that are on your table. If you have, please wave those. We'll have somebody come by and collect those and try to ask a couple as well. So as we move into our questions, I think the news overall has been good. We've, Everybody should be in a good mood as you head out to the weekend. I think the only red flags that I saw were the government debt comment from Ellen, and then the Buc-ee's effect that Mervin talked about that we need to be thinking about. But one thing I do want us to do before we get off of interest rates completely, so Ellen did make kind of a prediction on interest rates, where you thought they would go this year. I think you said we'd start seeing some decreases in June, and then probably 100 basis points, I think is what you're expecting. Is that correct? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's correct. So I think in my comments I said, we do think that the market has jumped the gun. Not jumped the gun and assuming that rates will be lower this year. Rates will be lower this year. But jumping the gun on when the Fed might begin. I think it takes a long time for policymakers to come to consensus without a catalyst. There's no particular catalyst driving them toward cutting rates, imminently. And so we think the data will be fully supportive for them to start cutting by June. But this is not emergency cuts. It's not a recession-like economy. And the amount of cutting that the markets have priced in is assuming that there's some evil lurking around the corner and that the Fed is going to be doing recession-like cuts. And so it's really just a difference of opinion on the outlook. Disaster or okay? And we're in the okay camp.
That's Greg. Mervin, do you see it any differently?
Well, I think one of the interesting points in terms of the policy recalibration that we're going to see is that, as Ellen mentioned, we're likely to see the Fed react mechanically to inflation. So step one in that mechanical reaction is to get short-term measures of inflation that are in line with the target. And that's already the case. As we saw this morning, we have 6-month, 3-month measures of inflation that are pretty close, pretty much at target or slightly below. So that's very encouraging. But there is still that fear of the 1970s and 1980s when there were reversals in policy that led to more persistent inflation. And Fed Chair Powell is very much aware of that risk, and I think that's one of the key reasons why he's likely to be a little bit slower in terms of guiding the committee towards easing monetary policy. It will happen, but I think it will be a little bit more cautious than what you would otherwise expect if you had these types of inflation prints in normal circumstances.
Mervin?
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with those. I think that's probably the path that we're likely to see from the Federal Reserve. I'd like them to go a little faster. I'm sure most people in this room would like them to go a little faster, but I don't think we're going to get it unless we get significantly lower inflation than we've seen even today.
Now I want to move on to, Greg used the comment or the phrase outperformance, especially for 2023, globally and within the U.S. And I think under almost any measure, as you guys clearly showed today, that we did outperform expectations. Yet public opinion poll after public opinion poll seems to reflect this pessimism about the economy right now. So can you guys talk about that? Is that kind of a function of our political divide in our country, or is that something that much more fundamental that may be playing into that? And Ellen, I'll go to you first.
Sure. So the sentiment data can get pretty confusing at times. One particular measure, the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Measure, actually showed a sudden surge in sentiment last week. And you couldn't point to a particular catalyst, but it drew attention because you go back decades, and I think this measure goes back to the 1950s, and it did used to have a very close relationship with consumer spending. But that has broken down over time, and my husband will tell you that when I feel good, I spend, and when I feel like hell, I spend. And he can't figure it out. So sentiment data, from my perspective, wouldn't tell you a lot about what the consumer is doing. But there are very useful pieces within those surveys. Buying plans. Is it a good time to buy a home right now? Is it a good time to buy a vehicle right now? How do you feel about your future finances? That can be really important because how you feel about your future finances tends to dictate how you spend today. The political divide of it, I think, is going to come into play this year, obviously being an election year. We did look at the data when it came out, and it looked like confidence had jumped across all political affiliations, but you will see massive divergence in those measures. You know, I think back to 2016, when in 2016, in September, the measure showed record high confidence among Democrats and record low among Republicans. And then the election happened, Hillary didn't win, and suddenly it switched in the other direction. So it looked like confidence held up, but it was Republicans had record high confidence and Democrats had record low confidence. There was nothing wrong with the economy. Democrats continued to spend. They just felt like hell because their candidate didn't get elected. And we're going to see similar volatility around the election this time as well.
Any other comments, Greg or Mervin, you'd like to add?
Well, I think my wife has the same condition as you do in terms of shopping, but in terms of the sentiment
Condition,
gauges-
it's a condition.
It's a condition. There might be others in the audience that have the same issues. But in terms of sentiment, I think one of the factors that is driving sentiment and will likely continue to drive sentiment is this ongoing comparison with the way things were before the pandemic. We're looking at things the way they were 4 years ago in terms of the cost of goods, the cost of services, the cost of labor, interest rates, and it's still going to take a bit of time until we readjust to that environment. But what's very interesting in the economic data is that it's not what people say that matters, it's what they do. Because a lot of gauges of sentiment, whether it's consumer sentiment or business sentiment, are depressed, and they would otherwise indicate a recession. And yet here we are in an economy that's growing at a 2% pace with consumers driving that growth forward and business investment still going strong. So I think that's very important to keep in mind, that dichotomy between sentiment and actual spending.
Greg, the next one's for you, and we've got several questions from the audience around geopolitical risk. And so a couple of those related to China. So China, the accuracy of the data that they provide, the reliability of them as a trading partner of the future for the world. That's one set. And then the other is just the impact of the two wars that are being fought right now. So any comments on those risks that you'd like to add?
Sure. I mean, I think it goes back to this idea that globally we're in an environment that is fragile on the supply side. And increasingly that matters for businesses around the world. The two wars that are ongoing, the war in Ukraine and the war in the Middle East, are very important to monitor closely because they could suddenly lead to supply disruptions that in turn feed into the inflationary process and could potentially, that's not our base case, but could potentially reverse some of the very encouraging progress that we've seen in terms of global disinflation. And that in turn, with slow economic activity, reduce the incentive for central banks to ease monetary policy as fast as expected and lead to an environment that is not as rebalanced as we've been discussing over the past few minutes. So that is certainly a risk. I think we also have to keep in mind the channels through which these geopolitical disruptions affect economic activity. One of the channels is trade disruptions, supply disruptions, logistical disruptions. The other is the effect that it can have on commodities prices and financial markets. And those disruptions can actually be much quicker than the actual trade disruptions. So if you think about the Red Sea situation right now, ships are having to go around Africa. It adds about 10 days. It adds a significant amount of cost in terms of the shipping cost. But what really matters is how that then in turn affects market sentiment and potentially any spillovers of the tensions in the Middle East, how they affect oil prices, because that has an immediate impact on the price and inflation dynamics around the world. So it's very important to just understand not just the events, where they're happening and how they're happening, but their potential global ramifications.
Thank you, Greg. I think we have time for a couple more questions, and go to Ellen next. And Ellen, we have a question from the audience around the impact to the commercial real estate market, really the vacancy rate, and what do we expect the impact of that to be to that market. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think any of us that have been around long enough, and I've lived through the 80s collapse in CRE, know that it can be a very hairy problem for the U.S. And even after the GFC, we saw how long it took to absorb vacancy rates, quite a long time. Now, the industry mix was different there. It was retail that really took so long, this time because of distortions around COVID that could lead to structural issues in terms of more people working from home than pre-COVID, so less need for office space. You could imagine that in some sectors like office space, in parts of the country, it would take even longer for that absorption. And that means that though the decline in prices for commercial real estate did not pan out to be as bad as people first thought, I think it plays out over a much longer period of time. In terms of, is it a systemic issue for the economy overall, something that monetary policy makers would monitor? Don't think that they've become complacent on it. They talked about it a lot, and they've stopped talking about it. But there are special groups at the Fed that still look very closely at it to monitor it and be sure that there's not broader spillover to the economy. I think what we've been surprised is that the 10-year run-up in valuations leading up to COVID gave them much more cushion than we thought to internally finance rollovers. You've had debt rollovers, you've had amend and extend that banks were much more willing to do. And so I think what it's done is elongate the problem. And sometimes that's the best that we can do. Think about the European debt crisis, right? It ended up being a slow-moving train wreck that the economy could better handle because you could diversify away from it over time.
Thank you. And Mervin, the last question to you, and I used the phrase golden era of economic development for the state earlier, and many others are using similar type language, and really like to have your perspective on, first of all, do you agree with that? And then second of all, how do we, there's no question whether it's a golden era or not, there's a lot of momentum. And so how do we capitalize and maximize that momentum? And are there a couple, 2 to 3 policy things you would like to see us do, either through the public sector or the private sector, to truly capitalize on that momentum?
I think one of the things that has helped us as a state that we need to do, or we need to continue to do, because it has been successful, is instead of trying to market the entire state all as one, and very, very diverse state, a lot of different businesses. We've seen regions actually take the lead role here. Started in Northwest Arkansas, but Central Arkansas had their Love Little Rock program. Jonesboro has their program as well. And they're attracting people directly on what's available in those regions. And those are the best performing regions of our state. And their ability to attract new businesses helps the other regions of our state as well. And then outside of that, you're seeing Fort Smith try the same thing. So they have their new air base operations. You see a lot of downtown development going on in Fort Smith in a way that you have not seen in several years before that. And then you combine that with stuff that we will get, hopefully, fingers crossed, somewhere in 26 or 27 when those lithium extraction reaches its full potential in southern Arkansas, and that will help accelerate some of the stuff that we've done around El Dorado. The piece that I don't see us doing a whole lot of yet is trying to get some of those jobs in chips manufacturing, EVs. There's a lot of federal incentives available for all those private sector manufacturing. All of our surrounding states have gotten some of that, and we haven't. And that tends to be a function of the fact that our educational attainment rate still is lower than most states, including our surrounding states. And so we're not getting those chip manufacturers, we're not getting those EV manufacturers here in our state. We do have a new research facility being built at the University of Arkansas that is going to prototype silicon carbide semiconductors. But again, that's out in 2026 when it'll be fully functional. It'll bring businesses to prototype semiconductors here, and we're training people in that industry at that center as well. So again, so much, there's $60 billion, I think, in incentives that the federal government has, and people are snapping it up, and we're not getting any at this point.
Thank you. So that wraps up our panel discussion for this afternoon. I'd like to give a big hand to our panelists for the outstanding job they did today. Really. To help us think about the future anyway. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Dean Brent Williams, and Dean Williams is going to wrap us up. Thank you.
Well, Curtis, thank you so much for being our moderator. You did a wonderful job, and Greg, Ellen, thank you for joining us, and all three of your honors. A small scholarship will be given to a Walton College student for travel to the National Association of Business Economics, so I'm sure they will enjoy that. And Mervin, always, thank you for your insights. Thank you for choosing to be with us today. This is the 30th year that you have supported the Walton College with this event, so thank you for that. I can't wait to see you in 2025. Have a wonderful day and great weekend.